The movie moguls didn't need to be loved. They wanted to win. Hollywood power was a gambler's game. Darryl Zanuck was one production head who was unafraid to risk adding an edge to movie storytelling. He was convinced that controversy could be just as saleable as escapist entertainment.
He was the youngest of all of the moguls. He believed you have to entertain, but you can also have some substance and say some important things.
Zanuck and director Mervyn LeRoy brought out the big guns with I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, a devastating indictment of the Southern penal system.
Take a look at that. The skunk.
It starred Paul Muni, a veteran of the Yiddish Art Theater and Broadway.
You're next.
Showing the influence of movies beyond entertainment, it led to prison reforms.
I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang is, to me, the very nadir of hopes and aspirations as you've ever seen on the screen. And they just said, screw it, let's make this movie. It was the joy of being able to make 50 movies a year. There was room for this.
It was all going to be so different.
It is different. They've made it different.
Big studios like Warner Brothers, where Zanuck worked, could afford to take an occasional box office risk. Not fiercely independent Samuel Goldwyn.
I never saw him as a mogul. He did not run a large plant with hundreds of people bowing and yesing him, lots of little busy assistants and vice presidents and all of that stuff. He was just one guy. He says, the day I put money under the door and wait for something to happen, he says, I'm out of this business.
Every time Sam Goldwyn wanted to make a movie, he went to the Bank of America and took out a loan, and he would put his house up as collateral. So there was always a period of sweating it out for him until the returns actually came in.
I remember when my father would come home at night and he'd say, and I was just a kid, I must have been about 7, and he'd say, well, we paid off the bank today. And I would get a little glass of beer to drink.
Sam Goldwyn was an independent who had to make it on his own. But during the early 30s, in the shadows of the big Hollywood studio gates, there was a neighborhood filled with much more marginalized independents. It was called Poverty Row, home to Columbia Pictures, controlled by another street-savvy tough guy, Harry Cohn, the son of an immigrant tailor. Cohn learned to pitch as a song plugger. In 1920, Harry joined his older brother Jack and Universal executive Joe Brandt in a company called CBC, named after the partners' initials. Hollywood insiders laughed because the letters also stood for corned beef and cabbage. In 1924, CBC became Columbia Pictures, a more high-class sounding name, but the Coen Brothers Company was still headquartered in Poverty Row, and their product far from prestigious.
When people went to the movies and looked at the screen, if they saw the Paramount Mountain or the MGM Lion, they would start applauding. If they saw Columbia's Lady with a Torch, they would start booing, which tells you something about the movies of the era.
Harry Cohn and his brother Jack were entrepreneurs. They wouldn't have called themselves that. They wouldn't have known what the word meant, but that's what they were. Cohn was a rough, foul-mouthed character who gained admiration from people who knew how to deal with him and how to dish it out in return. But he could be abusive. He could be really abusive.
The stories were rampant that he had phones on the studio lot tapped, that he could listen into almost any conversation. And his brother Jack, who lived on the East Coast and with whom he founded the company, they hated each other. And he was at a board meeting where they had to physically be pulled apart because they had a fist fight.
Harry Cohn may have tyrannized his brother Jack, but he found a creative collaborator in a former Mack Sennett gag man, Frank Capra.
And a man like Capra needs a man like Cohn just as much as a man like Cohn needs a man like Capra. And that was the beauty of their relationship. I think they hated each other, but also loved each other. Always in Hollywood history, we see the conflict between art and commerce, represented by the talent, the star, or the director, and the businessman, the mogul, or the head of the studio. This is the story of Hollywood, and out of that conflict has always come something great. Frank Capra was a classic example of the American immigrant story of his era. He came as a 6-year-old boy from Sicily in steerage to the United States of America, where he rose to the very top of the heap. He found the streets of gold.
In the roller coaster world of Hollywood, all it took was one film to lift Columbia from the depths of Poverty Row to the Academy Awards, the ultimate symbol of movie success. At the 1935 Academy Awards ceremony, it happened one night, swept the year with the 5 top Oscars. Overnight, Harry Cohn was playing with the big guys, more respectable and maybe even more hated, but certainly a studio head who proved he could turn out good pictures. With his success, Frank Capra went on to make a series of comedy dramas where the little guy still had a chance.
I think it was John Cassavetes said maybe there never really was an America in the 1930s. Maybe it was all Frank Capra, because Capra really defines that decade so much in his movies.
Frank Capra's artful populism added a sentimental glow to tough Depression times and made a hero of the common man. But far from the power centers of Hollywood, there was one movie maker who knew American injustice and opportunity firsthand. Born in 1884, Oscar Micheaux was the son of a freed slave.
He was a man who really didn't see boundaries for himself as an African American. He just didn't see the restrictions that the dominant culture was putting on African Americans. I mean, he believed you could really break through them.
By the 1930s, Micheaux had been in the movie business for more than a decade. Beginning as a farmer, he started writing novels in 1913. Then, partly as a response to the birth of a nation, he turned to movie making. His 1920 film Within Our Gates deals with the hypocrisies of racial purity and the horrors of lynching. Micheaux would go on to direct 42 movies as the market for race films grew among African American audiences who were either stereotyped or ignored by Hollywood.
I mean, this is so audacious. Who does this man think he is? He was so charismatic. He looked as if it was God coming to deliver a sermon. He just had all of this presence and this great fire within him to do something. So he's really advising the Black community to lift itself up. Race movie companies just flourished around the country. They might be in New Jersey using Fort Lee. They might be in part of Florida. They might be in Chicago. When sound does come in, it's expensive. They don't always understand it. Micheaux keeps going.
Until the end of his career in the late 1940s, Oscar Micheaux survived with a mix of entertainment, sensationalism, and social currency. Like the Jewish founders of Hollywood, he was reimagining America on screen. With the power of motion pictures, Micheaux and other pioneering Black filmmakers were creating an on-screen world that was separate and not equal, yet it was theirs. The films of Oscar Micheaux exposed the injustice and unfinished business of the American dream. Some of the most entertaining and deeply comforting movies of the 1930s came from an unlikely mogul and a star who happily worked for nothing. The mogul was a lanky former commercial artist from Kansas City, and his star was an ink and paint hero named Mickey.
Walt Disney was a Midwesterner, poor, grew up, with a father who was kind of a ne'er-do-well. But Walt had a drive. Where this drive came from, whether it was poverty that stilled that that need to succeed in him? I can't say. But he was always working harder than he had to make a better product than he had to, even if it meant making less money than he could have.
In the 1930s, Disney, ever the innovator, was among the first to embrace the expressive power of the Technicolor film process, and his animation was the first to be honored with an Oscar. At the same time, the song Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, from his 1933 cartoon short, Three Little Pigs, became a sassy answer to Depression gloom, proving again the power of the movies to inspire as well as amuse.
Walt was never happy repeating himself. That seems clear. Having figured out sound and music, having figured out color, he knew that the next advance had to be a longer cartoon, and he thought about a feature-length cartoon. Nobody in the film industry wanted it. They said he was a fool. They said he was recklessly ambitious to want to produce a feature-length film because, after all, who would want to see one? Who would sit through it? It was actually said that watching a color cartoon that long would hurt your eyes.
In 1937, it took the support of Hollywood's longtime banker A.H. Giannini to get the money to complete Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But the persistence and power of Disney's imagination produced one of the biggest grossing movies of all time. When no one took cartoons seriously, Walt Disney did. He licensed his work to distributors, but always kept the rights. And as with Chaplin, he was among the first to recognize the power of merchandising.
Walt Disney occupied his own space, both literally and figuratively, in Hollywood. I think of him as a visionary, truly a visionary. And I think of him more in league with Thomas Edison than I do with Louis B. Mayer or Adolf Zucker.
Despite Disney's artful animation, the expressive power of color technology was still new and expensive in 1939. But when the film The Wizard of Oz changed from black and white to Technicolor, the Depression seemed to fade away. Audiences entered a world of Hollywood imagination, and a luminous new star led the way. Raised in vaudeville, Frances Gumm found her way into the movies and the overwhelming embrace of MGM. Here she became Judy Garland. Although it wasn't a major hit at first, the magic of The Wizard of Oz would become more powerful with time. In 1939, the world was on the edge of catastrophe, far more devastating than a Kansas tornado. Hollywood stars like Judy Garland would not only entertain, they would offer hope and a sense of security.
If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow.
Judy Garland touched audiences with her vulnerability, with her humanity, unlike any other star in Hollywood. She reached out to people and wrapped them up in her arms.
The Hollywood moguls were always on the lookout for promising stars and great stories. Like The Birth of a Nation 24 years before, Gone with the Wind was based on a novel, one of the most successful in American history. And again, it showed the power of Hollywood to reimagine America's past. Times had changed by the 1930s. David O. Selznick was eager to surpass the record profits of The Birth of a Nation, but avoid the controversy that D.W. Griffith had created.
One of the things which Selznick set out to do was get to the black press and let them see that we're making this movie and that we want to give important roles to African-American actors and actresses. There's also a section in Gone with the Wind in the novel where the Ku Klux Klan comes into the story, and they get rid of it.
All the movie moguls were tough and driven men. David O. Selznick was perhaps the most obsessive of them all.
Long before I was born, my father already was compulsive. He already said to people, you know, there aren't enough hours in a day. That's the problem with the day. I need 21 or 22 hours. Why do I have to go to sleep at night? So when Benzedrine and Dexedrine were prescribed to him, I think during Gone with the Wind, he said, oh, this is wonderful. Now I can have 22 hours a day.
Grossing more than $20 million in its first run and winner of a record 10 Oscars, Gone with the Wind was the most successful movie ever produced.
This is one of the happiest moments of my life.
When Hattie McDaniel was honored with an Oscar, it also suggested that Hollywood imagery had the power to change attitudes about race in American movies. But there was a long way to go.
When they had the big opening in Atlanta and all the stars coming, Vivian Leigh back in the United States, Olivia de Havilland, of course, Clark Gable with Carol Lombard. Hattie McDaniel was not there at that opening. They did not want her there because of the South and the South's attitude.
I don't know nothing about bunting babies.
And there was criticism of Gone with the Wind within the African American community. At the same time, it was enjoyed.
Even though Gone with the Wind was set during the Civil War, for audiences in 1939, the disruption and struggles of Scarlett O'Hara mirrored the dislocations in Depression America.
And God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again.
Gone with the Wind represented the Hollywood dream factories at a peak of profitability and power. For the moguls, it had been a remarkable success story. Yet as powerful as they had become, many of the immigrant studio heads remained insecure. When Hitler and Nazism began their anti-Semitic rise in Europe during the 1930s, with the exception of the brash Warner Brothers, the Jewish moguls hesitated to speak out. They feared losing vital German markets and calling attention to their Jewish roots, which could arouse anti-Semitism in an America overwhelmingly against going to war.
I think one of the most important things for these Jews who came to this country, not just the moguls, but for an entire generation or two of Jewish immigrants, was to assimilate. And part of that was not necessarily to deny being Jewish, but it was just not to broadcast it either. That was certainly the case here in Hollywood, where they were producing this all-American art.
While other Jewish moguls were hesitant, retired Universal Studios founder Uncle Carl Laemmle hadn't forgotten his immigrant past.
He would visit Laupheim, go back to Germany every year, never miss. Of course, when Hitler came in power, then he was no longer allowed to enter Germany, and he wanted to do anything that he could to relieve the situation for the Jews there. He brought between 400 and 500 families over. Some went to other countries, but a lot of them came to the United States.
When Carl Laemmle died in 1939 at age 72, the Hollywood he had helped create had triumphed during a turbulent decade. More than ever, audiences were captivated by movie dreams. But as the United States approached the unknowns of the 1940s, the coming attractions would become nightmares, and they were real.